Three. Okay, and we're recording. My name is Jonathan Cohn. I'm the chair of the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. The live stream component of this did not work, unfortunately, but fortunately, we have an amazing guest today, Tracy Novick, who's one of the best, let's say, education budget experts in Massachusetts. And somebody who should definitely follow, but we'll get into that later. But Tracy, can you just introduce yourself and just say a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So my full-time job is I work for the State Association of School Committees, where, as you might imagine, I, among other things, handle school finance and social media. I also am a member of the Worcester School Committee, and I am married, mother of 3 children, all now sequestered in our small home in Worcester, here in the forest. And much like everyone else, doing most of my connecting via Zoom these days.
Yeah, right. That one thing that I thought would just be a good kind of almost a little bit of backstory to kind of the discussion about how this has all been affecting local budgets, especially school budgets, is to take a step back about a recent good thing that happened of the Student Opportunity Act.
Yeah.
Can you refresh people's memory about like what that bill was, what kind of all went into that, and why it was so necessary?
Lo, these many years ago, right? It feels like November was years. Right. So Massachusetts, for those of you who don't know, actually has a state funding system for education, which has a logical basis and is actually something you can explain, which by itself is not something that's true everywhere. So we should give ourselves credit where credit is due. It came together initially in 1993. It was actually part of the education reform law. So people who are around education are familiar with 93 ed reform. Usually we talk about it in terms of the MCAS or state standards or those kinds of things, but it actually was a school funding bill. It's because the state lost a lawsuit and actually had to put together an answer for coming up with a statewide formula. Part of that was they were supposed to periodically have updates to the funding formula, and the state had not. So after lots of pushing from all kinds of people, the Teachers Association, the school committees, the superintendents, it was passed as part of a budget about 5 years ago. And they've actually had a commission that came together and found that we probably were under-calculating the foundation budget statewide by about $2 billion.
Wow. So
that was sort of like okay, now we have a thing. And then we had to have somebody actually do something about it. So there were a number of different efforts that happened over the course of the past 5 years. A bunch of different kinds of bills got filed. We had what seemed like we were finally going to get there almost 2 years ago now, and that fell apart in conference committee. And then together they actually did pass, both the House and the Senate passed a bill which Governor Baker signed in November, which was the Student Opportunity Act. And it not only dealt with all of the pieces of the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations, but it also had
remind us what they were.
Sure. So there were 4 funding recommendations as part of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. There was a requirement around data reporting too, because part of what the commission said is we are trying to put together all this information, but we don't feel like we have good information to pull from. So we should do a better job on that. So that's the 5th one, and we don't want to leave that one out. When it comes to funding, there were 4 findings. The first one was health insurance, which anyone who knows even the smallest bit about health insurance will not be surprised that when they said in 1993, here's how much we think health insurance is going to be, and here's how much we think it's going to go up, those numbers were wrong. And honestly, the main problem is that the funding formula goes up by a percentage each year. And it was a percentage across the board rather than one that said, oh, but health insurance goes up by 7% or 8%, not like 1.5% or 2 or 3%. So compounded over time, you can imagine how that becomes a problem. The second one was special education, which honestly, in some ways is parallel to health insurance. We have changed how we handle students with special needs in the past 25 years. If anyone who, is about my age, which I know is older than your age, but nonetheless, might remember there being a resource room down the end of the hallway at some other part of the school, and those kids you didn't actually usually see during the day. And that was how we did special ed when we actually first were bringing, honestly, students with special needs into the public schools, which only happened since the 70s. We have figured new things out. We're doing better with students like that. We're honestly doing better with most students, but that costs more money. And so part of recognizing that was in the foundation budget. The third thing was English language learners. And we not only have had a growing population of English language learners in Massachusetts, we also have realized something which you will not be surprised by, and most people who are around, in particular, immigrant cities won't be surprised by. But we had sort of an idea in our head when this passed in the early 90s that most students who were English language learners were going to be people who were going to be little kids who were coming in kindergarten, right? They spoke a different language at home, they came into the public school system, and then we got them through the system, and by the time they were probably leaving elementary school, they would be entirely fluent in English. And of course, that's totally not how we have English language learners, right? We've got like kids who come over from like Rwanda on airplanes, who've been in, who have escaped from foreign armies, who next thing you know are in our classrooms and they're 16 years old and they're our kids. And we've got kids from all over who are all kinds of ages. And we know, first of all, if you know anything about languages, it gets more complicated as you get older, but also we don't have those students as long. So we need to push more resources in for them in order to actually get them to a level of fluency that much faster. That's the third thing. The fourth thing is low income. And we actually have a progressive funding formula, which not only gives supports more of the funding for low income communities, but it also includes in the calculation the idea that if you are poorer, you should have more resources invested in you by the community, because we potentially are going to need to make up ground with what you need. And also you potentially are not getting the kinds of enrichment that other children might be from their home environments, whether that's, everything from museums to foreign languages to music lessons to whatever. So that portion of it was heavily studied, honestly, and I give a lot of credit to the Mass Budget and Policy Center, among others, for doing a lot of work when we were actually having the commission, looking at different kinds of models of how much money does it actually take. And what they came back with, which is what the Foundation Budget Review Commission adopted, was it takes between 50% and 100% more funding for a low-income student in order to get the supports that they need. And that was what the commission adopted. And the progressive funding formula that's in the Student Opportunity Act does eventually, over the course of 7 years, get us to 100% more funding for the highest concentrations of poverty. So part of what they do in the funding calculations is they look at the percentage of students within your student body that are living in poverty, and a higher percentage of students means a higher dollar amount per student, with the idea that that's more for the district to be supporting. And so you need greater amounts of support. So that was all in the Student Opportunity Act. There's also a bunch of other stuff in there, like rolling ourselves towards full funding of charter reimbursement, looking at some of the, and putting together a bunch of study commissions around rural schools, which we desperately need in the, in my part of the state and west of us, looking at the municipal wealth formula, which is kind of the other side of the calculation of who actually pays for all of this. So there was a bunch of work that went on. I give Senator Lewis and Representative Peisch a lot of credit, because they clearly just not only looked at the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which we also want to make sure we credit Senator Sonia Diaz, who laid it all on the line in terms of fighting, particularly for low-income kids, but also really had incorporated a lot of other concerns that were kind of raised along the way, to say this is a big deal, this is a lot, but also this isn't everything. This is going to hit the highest need and the highest poverty, but there's other issues in Massachusetts that we also need to be looking at. So that was in November, and we got to go to high school. I was there. I swear that it happened. I saw it. And then the question, part of what I did is presentations, because I do presentations on the Foundation Budget Review Commission, particularly for school committee members, is I said, now this is great and we should celebrate this, but there's no money in the bill right? This is a commitment, and it's a promise, and it passed unanimously in both houses, which is amazing. Like, nothing ever does that. I don't need to tell you that, but that never happens, right? So that was great, but now we need to fund it. And so that has been what we all were kind of expecting we were going to be looking at for FY21 of, okay, that was last year, that was November, you guys have had some time to plan, how does it actually roll out? And so when the governor came out with his budget, the first thing we did was sort of pull it all apart and say, how'd we do? A number of us had some concerns around how the poverty portion was being incorporated.
Which he wasn't.
That. It also feels like ancient history in many ways. Like, wow, we were having a fight about that.
And he
so
didn't
there was some
question. In the first place,
exactly. So there was some question as to whether, like, how everything was gonna respond. And part of what we had been considering as we were going into April, and that would have been generally been the House budget, was the House going to respond to this in any kind of a different way? So that's where we're at. We're supposed to be in year 1 of a 7-year phase-in. There's target numbers in the bill of sort of where we're supposed to end up 7 years from now. And the 7 years is only magic insofar as that's how long it took us to phase in the foundation budget the first time we did this back in '93.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, I had wondered, like, why 7?
Why 7? It's a biblical number. Like, lots of things happen in 7s, right? No, it's because of that. And I think the idea is supposed to be that it's long enough that there's not too much pressure on any single year. I think I don't think there's necessarily any other magic to the number.
And so what does that look like now, especially given the kind of current economic climate?
So it's funny that I keep getting the what are we going to do about the budget question, and then like everyone I know keeps then turning to the state and saying, what are we going to do about the budget? I was on a call this afternoon with Desi, and the answer that kept coming back from
what stand for?
Sorry, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I apologize. Yes, stop me from my lingo. So essentially everyone's, all the business managers, all the people who run the finance and the school districts are saying, yeah, okay, so what's happening? And the department's saying, we don't know either. So it sounds like right now, in terms of the state budget overall, the House is waiting for the Governor's Office of Administration and Finance to sort of come out with the renewed revenue picture for FY21 for next year, before the House then dares come out with their version of the budget. Because usually we would, like, the governor already put out his budget, the House would then put out their budget, then the Senate would put out theirs. But all of that agreement that they had on how much money they were going to have has completely gone by the wayside. So that's the first thing, is essentially the kind of the how much money are we going to have question. The last revenue, the testimony that they got at the roundtable that they did remotely that was actually looking at that revenue picture, there seemed to be some general agreement that we could be looking at a budget, or rather we could be looking at a loss of revenue of somewhere between $4 and $6 billion. And I don't know about you, but once the numbers start to get that big, they kind of get like, they don't necessarily mean anything. So, the way that I think about that is that the governor's budget for Chapter 70 for the education aid for the entire Commonwealth was supposed to be $5.1 billion for this year. So essentially the loss is equivalent to all of the state funding for general education.
Wow.
For K-12. So they're not going to do that. Like, lest anybody think that I'm somehow saying that they're just going to blow up Chapter 70. I'm not saying that. But it's a proportionality question. So I guess my question, which I don't know, is we had a lot of conversations over the last 5 years around matching dollar amounts to need, right? So that, yes, everybody gets Chapter 70 aid, but there are some districts that need it more than others because of their own lack of local ability to contribute, and also because of the amount of need in their communities. So we have a progressive funding formula. I guess my question is, are we really going to stand by that? One of the things, so we recently had the Deputy Commissioner of Education retire, Jeff Wolfson, who'd been with the department for something like 30 years. And one thing that the commissioner he came out of the finance end of things. one of the things he has always reminded us is that there's kind of two parts of the funding inside of the Chapter 70 formula. There's the part that's essentially kind of constitutionally required. There's the foundation funding. And there's the other pieces of funding that are in there kind of to politically make it all work. And again, this is just me explaining it this way. So if you're going to get angry, for those out there who are going to get angry at my explaining it, this is me. But that's the hold harmless and minimum aid. So essentially one of the abiding principles of Chapter 70, which previously wasn't written into the law, now actually is, because it became part of the law with the Student Opportunity Act, was that no district, regardless of what else is going on with them, would get less state aid than they had gotten in a prior year. Okay. Now, I should take a step back and explain that Chapter 70 at its base is founded on two principles. One is that it's a per pupil formula. So the head count of kids you actually have has to do with how much money you get. And then there's also a inflation factor. So how many kids you have and which kids those are is how they figure out how much money you get. That plus how much of it you can fund yourself. So if you're a district that has fewer kids than you had last year, the original calculation would be that you would probably, your foundation budget anyway, would be less than it would be the year before. But nobody who's a state representative is going to want to come back to their district and be like, oh yeah, so you're getting $1 million less this year. So that's just, they're not going to vote for that. So that's the hold harmless. And then the minimum aid increase is that everybody gets a bit more every year. So built into the SOA, and previously it just got passed as part of a budget, is that you get a minimum of $30 per pupil increase every year. But those are not essentially foundational principles. They're not based on need. They're not based on the same progressive kind of formula. So does the legislature decide that if they have to cut, that they cut there? I don't know that. That has happened sometimes. But if you look at the way that, for example, New York just came out with their state budget, and if you do a flat across the board kind of cut of everybody gets a 15% cut in their state aid, or everybody gets a whatever cut in their state aid, you inherently make the cut unprogressive. You make it, you actually target the communities that most need the aid, and that are least able to make that up locally. So that would be sort of my fear and recommendation.
Yeah, because for example, if you think about if there was like a cut from state aid, that's going to hit Weston and Brockton very differently. That if Weston, that like Weston can like kind of a Weston, a Wellesley, like a Newton, they can make up the difference. They can probably find a way to make up a difference in the money. Brockton or Lawrence probably will have a lot more difficulty in doing that.
Exactly. And when you look at sort of like how much are those communities that are wealthier already getting in their state aid, the proportionality of how much that cut is of their whole entire budget, because most of their budget is locally funded, versus how much it's going to be for Brockton or for Lawrence is huge. Because I mean, Lawrence and Holyoke get, I don't know, close to 90% of their budget in state aid. Yeah. And Wellesley and some of the more Weston, some of the more wealthy communities don't get any more than 17% of their foundation budget in state aid, and most of their funding well above that. So you're talking about something more like maybe 7% of their budget, less than that. So yeah, so that's sort of the fear and the thing to consider in terms of where we're at with the Chapter 70 formula.
Yeah. So what types of things have you been advocating for the legislature to do for, like, as they're putting together a budget, to make sure that we aren't like shortchanging the school children of Massachusetts?
I mean, so first of all, obviously the mass budget and also mass budget and some others put together, and also, I mean, the Boston School Committee passed a measure, I guess 2 weeks ago or so. There's a number of people who are essentially saying we need increased federal assistance. First of all, just flat need increased federal assistance. To those who say, okay, but schools have already gotten some because of the CARES Act, that's true. There's, I think, two concerns with the CARES Act. One is it's based on the Title I formula, which is the low income, the sort of poverty aid that comes from the federal government to school districts. Massachusetts actually lost some of its poverty count in the past year. So we're actually getting less Title I aid than we've gotten previously. And some districts are also going to get less Title I aid than they've got previously. Probably most of them are. So that's we may find that we got federal aid that was created for the CARES Act, but we may proportionally be losing even more in Title I. That's the first thing. The second thing is that under thinking of somewhat recent history, under the Obama's administration's ARRA funding that came to school districts, so that's sort of like the most recent version we've had of anything like this. What the state did was it took the amount of money that districts were getting for that funding, and they cut their Chapter 70 aid by that much. So essentially, it was the filler. We don't know that they're going to do that. They may not do that.
Yeah.
But I think that every district out there is saying, this wasn't that long ago. I mean, I was even on a school committee at that point. Like, I remember that happening. We need to be careful about us running out and saying, oh, well, we've got some of this money to fill, holes in. We may not have that money to fill holes in because it might actually essentially be our Chapter 70 aid next year. So those are, sort of concerns for the money we've got so far. So more federal funding for sure. I think the focus on the most vulnerable is important. And part of that is not just the same sort of argument around Chapter 70, although it's related. One of the things that school funding economists have found is that the districts that are most vulnerable during an economic downturn are the districts that are dependent on state aid for an interesting reason, because state aid largely comes from income taxes. Districts that are mostly dependent on local aid mostly get their revenue from property taxes. Property taxes are significantly less volatile during an economic downturn than income taxes are, which of course makes sense, right? We've seen, people are losing their jobs, but it isn't necessarily the people who are paying the property taxes that are losing their jobs.
Yeah.
And then if you actually look back at the history, this does actually bear out. So it isn't districts like Wellesley and Weston, and I mean, honestly, even just regular old middle-class districts, like districts that proportionally get most of their stuff locally, are honestly probably going to be less hit, and particularly less soon. The ones that are the most dependent on state aid are the ones that get hit most. And also, if you look at the way that cities tend to calculate their budgets, they absolutely still get most of their stuff through property taxes, no question. But it's also things like entertainment taxes and local hotel taxes and things like that, which of course are also the things that are getting hit. So with the exception of the districts that are in heavily tourist areas, so like interestingly, I saw headlines that were somewhat parallel from Lenox in the Berkshires and Martha's Vineyard that both said, okay, so what's tourism going to look like and how's that going to impact our tax base? Perfectly reasonable. Like, are you going to be able to bear this out? But for much of the state, those kinds of questions aren't actually what's going to impact our budget. It's going to be, are people going to be able to pay their mortgage? Are they going to be able to pay their property taxes? In cities, it's going to be, what's the state doing? Because that's actually how we pay for our schools. So I guess that's really going to be the question of, is that money going to come through, and are we still actually going to be able to see Chapter 70 fund our schools? Because the places that are going to get hit the hardest, and I've been pushing everyone to look at New York as a warning example, because that's just what the Governor Cuomo did, is that he did an across the board cut, and it's tanking Rochester, it's tanking Buffalo. Obviously, it's really hitting New York City. Won't be parallel in Massachusetts, by the way, guys. Remember, Boston doesn't actually get most of its funding from the state. It gets most of its funding locally. But it will be Worcester and Brockton and Springfield that actually get hit the hardest if they do it that way.
Anything, so like as somebody on the Worcester School Committee, how have you been thinking about that from the perspective of Worcester itself, of what is the impact of all this, as well as we can talk about this on the budgetary level, but I also am curious to hear about what is the whole situation now like for the Worcester school system, given the way that schools have to adapt to everything. But budget and then on schools adapting.
Yeah, so from a budget perspective, I mean, something that I think most people don't realize, because we all live in our own little universes when it comes to local budgets. So then when I started to work for the state association, I was like, whoa, I didn't realize how many different realities there were. So there are school districts that pass their budgets in December. There are school districts that pass their budgets in February. Like, so there are school committees out there that passed their budgets a long time ago. Worcester and some of the other cities, we won't pass our budgets till June. And part of that is because we're so heavily dependent on state aid, but part of that also is because our budget just has to go through a city council. We don't have to have it to town meeting 45 days ahead of time and all the rest of that kind of thing. Interestingly, we're kind of many of us are still now in the same boat anyway, because of course most town meetings aren't happening.
Yeah.
So while the school committees pass their budgets, there's nothing else that's happened since then. So now the school committees are like, well, I don't know, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Like, what do we need to do and how many negotiations are we gonna have to go through? So that's kind of where that is. So, I mean, Worcester hasn't received our budget yet. We won't get it until the 15th. So we'll get it in about 9 days. We know that it's gonna be based on the governor's budget. And so locally, we're all kind of going, okay, it's gonna be nice, but it's gonna be a work of fiction. I mean,
yeah.
And I say this with absolute utter respect for our finance office. I think they probably will say the same. Like, that's great, but nobody thinks we're getting the governor's budget. So,
Yeah.
And I think that there was a hope when we had a conversation about this in March that maybe we would be passing it at the same time the House at least would be coming out with their budget. And then the only thing that the House has done around their budget is they postponed their deadline to July 1. And we're all like, okay, well, guess not, maybe not. So much for that idea. So yeah, I mean, and it's kind of a two-part thing, right? So to kind of get at the other half of your question, it's not just the revenue picture, it's what should you actually even be spending your money on?
Mm-hmm.
Because we all make our budgets based on not doing exactly the same thing as last year, but you're going to open a building and you're going to have teachers and you're going to have buses and you're right. Like that's kind of the place we write our budgets from, of course, because that's what schools look like.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're instead saying, are we even going to open a building? If we open a building, when are we going to open it?
Yeah.
How many teachers do we need? Are we even going to run buses? Are we going to be running a lunch program? Like all of the basic assumptions of what a school district is and looks like are all completely up in the air. And so, and I've been complaining about this online because I keep waiting for someone to write this article, and then every time I do, someone says, you need to write it yourself. But
I'm going to second that, whatever it is, without having even heard about it, you need to write the article.
But we all closed the schools, and we did it with exceptions. Like Fall River, I give Fall River a lot of credit. Fall River looked at what their kids had and didn't have, and they said, we cannot do this online, and we're not even going to pretend that we're doing it online. Everybody gets a packet, whatever it is, once a week, every 2 weeks, and that is how the school system runs. It's not going to be pretty, it's going to use a lot of paper, but that's what we're going to do. But most school districts in Massachusetts essentially said, okay, everything's online. Well, most school districts in Massachusetts aren't one-to-one, and Lord knows we haven't wired every child's home with internet. So what did we do? We just changed the entire K through 12 education system to one that is dependent on parents paying their charter or Spectrum or whoever it is bill, and parents having bought Chromebooks. That's not a public education system. That's not how this works. Like this is not the deal. This is not what the Constitution says. It's not what the McDuffie case said. And I keep waiting for someone to point this out, and so far no one has. Like I keep waiting for the commissioner to come out with something saying this isn't how, but no one has. So, I mean, there are districts that absolutely have worked on this. So first of all, there were districts that already were one-to-one that sent the Chromebooks or whatever it was home that said, here you go, this is a school district device, but you have it, you're going to use it for the interim. There are districts that scrambled really fast. Obviously, Boston put a massive package together, and as far as I can tell, bought every Chromebook on the Eastern Seaboard that wasn't already bought by New York City. And Springfield had one-to-one in many cases, pushed their Chromebooks out. Lawrence, I saw over the weekend, announced that they were even pushing out hotspots in various places. So there's been a lot of that kind of work. Worcester, I regret deeply to say, and it's a source of ongoing and constant fury and frustration for me, has been totally behind the eight ball. We have yet to hand out anything to students beyond special education students. We've got 21,000 Chromebooks that are locked in our schools that we have been told we cannot distribute until the 15th of May. And I am going to stop there because I'm going to save most of my ranting for tomorrow night when we meet as a school committee. But yeah, so my children at my house are on our internet with Chromebooks that we have bought, and that is how most of Worcester is functioning. Otherwise, we have sent out one set of packets. We've got a lot of kids who are trying to do things on smartphones. We've got some kids that we still haven't found. We've got some kids that we know we're not hearing from. And yeah, it's not only that we've had a division of the haves and have-nots, because we definitely have had that, but we also have had a question of how well has local leadership then coped with the reality. And I've seen a lot of great leadership in a lot of different places. Like, we've had superintendents who pushed back on parents that were saying, pedal the metal, we need to have these sing in front of their Chromebook for 6 hours a day. And there were people who were saying, whoa, this isn't how this works in the pandemic. There also have been superintendents who have said, like, the first thing we got to do is support kids. We got to push out food. We got to push out mental health supports. There have been a lot of good models around how are we supporting our staff, how are we making sure they get the support they need. So lots of great leadership that's happening in local districts, but it also is a place where there's been breakdowns in places too.
Yeah. No, the point that you made, it's striking to see just how it exacerbates various kinds of existing inequality, insofar as you noted, from when it comes to both from income and geography referring to, let's say, rural areas without good broadband, the ability to have, let's say, online learning isn't something that every kid has, because not only does does the house not necessarily have internet, you probably don't have one computer per person, unless you have, let's say, the income to have one computer per person. And then you also have the dimension of, like, not every kid is in a stable enough household where you can actually, like, have, like, a quiet enough space to devote the time, as well as parents then have to be there. Whereas typically, like, during the school day, you're like, the school day, a parent, if they have errands to run or if they go to work, your children are being taken care of in a place that is not the house. But you can't just, let's say, like, leave, even if you even were able to, and that has its own set of issues if you had to leave. But the fact that you then have to, as a parent, be present the whole day to make sure, like, just to make sure that the child is safe in the house or whatever, or find a way, if you can't be there, to pay somebody else to do that for you, or get a family member, and all of the kind of extra burden that ends up putting on parents.
And absolutely, and then sort of that gets compounded by, have you instructed a second grader in anything, or a kindergartner? Like, that's direct instruction. That's not read something and you learn it. So most of the elementary school kids actually need to have an adult sitting with them to do it. And whether you're doing, in many cases, sure, maybe you're doing a video call, maybe that's instructional, but is the kid going to be able to get on there themselves, or do they need something to help them? And then if your instruction is written, well, you don't learn how to read really well until you're in middle of elementary school. And then you take a place like Worcester, where 59% of our kids come to us speaking a first language other than English. Who's reading their curriculum? Like, I don't know, because we're telling people to send things through Google Translate, but like that's not a good instructional model either. So like all of this, of course, gets massively compounded once you start talking, as you said, about income and language. And there was an article in the Daily Hampshire Gazette out of Northampton about a student who's driving to the outside of the school every day to do her schoolwork. That's a model everywhere. And if that works, maybe you have a car, maybe you don't have a car, maybe you have a hotspot, maybe you don't have a hotspot. But that whole question too of the places the Globe wrote that article which compared Massachusetts to Rhode Island. I think we forget how small Rhode Island is compared to Massachusetts. I mean, we're not a big state, but Rhode Island's much smaller. And if you think that you can do a good comparison of Rhode Island to Massachusetts, I would invite you to, go visit Chesterfield, or, some of these other places that are out in Western Mass. You're not even going to have a cell signal, let alone find a hotspot. Like, it's just not happening. So don't think that everybody's going to jump on Google Classroom and do Zoom all day, because it's not going to, you can't do it.
And the one thing that I found concerning, and just saying something that I'd long feared, and saying that it seems to be coming in New York, is that the general forces of education privatization would latch on to that, like, push on distance learning for the sake of actually deterritorializing classrooms entirely. to be able to like, and kind of with that as like both as it takes away of like not having to have teachers and not having to have buildings and just having something that is like a pure profit because of how little you have to actually invest in the students.
Well, and there was this interesting sequence of, so the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education met last week, and they had this interesting sequence of public testimony, and I don't know where it was coming from. I think it was organized, but I don't think it was actually privatized, so to speak. But of people who were saying, well, we could just have one central repository of all of the lessons, and everyone could jump on the department's website and they could be learning from there. And like, all we need to do is get everybody an internet connection and we're all set. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, no, that's not gonna work. Because I mean, I know that certainly we talk about relationships and the loss of relationships and students and teachers in the classroom, but also just that sense that you have as a teacher of, this kid is doing okay with this kid needs help with this. And also the question of sort of who's struggling in general, and the idea that somehow we could just entirely depersonalize the educational system, it was stunning to me that would be something that someone would not only see as something that would be possible, but see as a good model.
Yeah, especially because of like the difficulty of making sure like that any child would like sit still and focus the whole day if they're not, like, it's difficult enough for people to do that in a classroom setting. If you're kind of like completely divorced from that, like, really?
Right. I mean, there was the thing that was going around on Twitter pretty early on of one of the kids who had managed to figure out a way to screenshot herself and then have that be her image on the Zoom classroom, and she was like off doing something else because she had already figured out how to work the technology. But yeah, like interestingly, one of the things that the department emphasized in their latest guidance to districts is the importance of engagement. And like, you need to make this interesting for kids because no one's standing over the third grader saying, yeah, you actually have to finish the math sheet. Like, unless that kid's actually engaged, there's really no and I mean, this has been the ongoing conversation that I've had with both teachers and students has been, why are you going to do the work? Well, most places we've kind of lost the grading thing, and I've seen people argue about that too, of why would they do the work if they don't get graded? Well, because they need to learn something. Like, that's actually what this is supposed to be about anyway. It's actually not supposed to be about the grades. It's supposed to be about getting an education. So, you know, I think that in some ways we maybe have brought some of that back down to brass tacks too, of, well, you know, you really need to learn algebra in order to be able to do higher level math, in order to be able to take physics, in order, like, there's stuff you got to know how to do. And that's actually what we're supposed to be trying to get through at this point now with the question around skills and material for the rest of the year, is what do you actually need to know in order for us to continue your education next year?
Yeah, because that gets to a great point of like, why would you want to like do all of the work? Because the next year is going to start, and at that next year, when there's already like a general curriculum set for what that next year in your cycle entails, you want to kind of know what you're doing.
Exactly. I mean, and honestly, I think that's probably the best argument we've got. Like, I mean, I've had, you know, some conversations with students, and they've said, well, why should I? And I was like, well, because you want to be a junior next year, and everyone's saying we're going to make you be a junior next year, and that's great, but you're going to need to learn trig. So, you know, or whatever it is. So yeah, that I think I've heard some arguments online where parents were like, well, why were you honest with them? You shouldn't have told them you weren't going to grade. And I'm just not, first of all, I'm just not into lying to children in general, like, or students in general. But secondly, like, okay, so we've removed a power. That's interesting that the power was what was important there. Like, we're shifting the power differentials in terms of who can control what. And interestingly, it brings me back when we were having a conversation around whether we were going to do PARCC or MCAS as a state test, and there were a bunch of parents that were pulling their kids out, and someone said, well, are we going to force the third graders to take it? And I remember the late Commissioner of Education, Mitchell Chester, saying, well, we're not going to like tie the kid to the debt. I mean, like, you can't make a third grader take a test who says he doesn't want to take a test. Like, you actually can't force a kid to do that. It doesn't work. And this is something that I think every educator and parent comes to a different realization on. Like, if the kid says he's not going to eat the whatever, he's not going to eat the whatever, and there's nothing you can do about that. So we need to be persuading this, we need to be going about this in a different way than maybe we were. And I think that that's probably a valuable conversation to be having.
That reminds me of how it was wild how for a very long time, both Baker and also, let's say, like the Boston Globe editorial board were just kind of insistent that there needed to be MCAS tests this year because it was valuable, when like it just seemed kind of divorced from reality that like if like what useful data would you be getting from a test that you then can't compare to other years, because in this year there's a pandemic and they aren't in the classroom. So like what
And interestingly, some of the people who I know who actually are sort of most sort of understanding of how the state accountability system works, because that was actually one of the questions I got, was one about state accountability early on, were saying, well, no, because we've disrupted the data. Like you can't compare this anymore. We've lost comparability. So there isn't really any reason for us to do this because we already know that the data is going to be weird. Like if at some point you want to go in and assess what kids have lost, okay, you might want to do that with a different system than the MCAS, because I don't think that's necessarily going to help you. At some point, someone's going to need to ask that question, but you're not going to get a how are we doing on this compared to how we were doing last year and the year before, which is what we were trying to do, is to actually draw trend lines. So yeah, I think a question of sort of understanding what we're doing and why is one part of what's going on there.
Yeah. One thing that you alluded to a little while ago that I think is like a great point is the question of like, what is the purpose of education in the first place? And I'd be curious, it's like, if you had to answer that question, if somebody asked you like, what is even the purpose of our public education system? What would you say?
I'd say that the state constitution answers it for us. And this is something that I will happily bore people to tears about. The Massachusetts is you probably know, has the oldest written, still operable constitution on the planet. And it also was the first state constitution in the United States to have a section that actually includes public education. And all of the other states now have one. If you read all of them, and you can find them online, you will find that many of them sound a lot like Massachusetts because they stole our language. And I can say that because we voted it first. But it actually lays out, as part of the system of state government, that we have to have public education in order to continue to have a functioning democracy. And so that is the purpose of public education. And that is what we're supposed to be doing, is we're supposed to, and for all that I know that the Globe was having a debate this week about whether or not we should get rid of town meetings, I always think it's important particularly when I talk to school committees about this, to remind people that when they were writing the Constitution and talking about having a functional government, they're not just talking about having a functional state government, they're talking about having a functional local government. And the Massachusetts local government model is town meeting, which means that everyone who can vote has a voice and is expected to be able to use that voice, and not just to vote, but to actually like understand enough about whatever it is that comes in front of them, the budget. I mean, I was in a town meeting last year that was talking about like property bounds and rezoning things, and it was part of the town charter. And if you were there, you had a vote, so you should know enough about how this works to be able to do that. Like, you might need to know climate science, and you might need to be able to follow city charters, and you should know a little bit about history. And so I think that that's really important, that it's not just the sort of model of citizenship we think of going into a ballot box and like filling in a circle or whatever it is. It's actually the model that says you're going to be with your fellow citizens in a group, and you're going to together decide the future of your local community. And we need to be educating kids to be able to participate in whatever that model is.
Kind of like a model idea of like democracy as like collective self-governance.
Yes.
In that sense. That kind of requires you to be able to kind of know enough about the different issues, as well as to be able to like spot BS coming from politicians. And it's
all of it, right? And make a good argument, and that like will persuade other people, and all of those things. And I mean, obviously there are different models now, and we all participate in different ways, and we have people who we educate who cannot unfortunately vote. But that doesn't mean that you're not participating in the public discourse, that you're not still attempting to persuade, that you shouldn't know about, how things function, and weigh in on decision making and all of that kind of stuff. So that's what we're supposed to be doing here.
Yeah. It reminds me of the general kind of like importance of critical thinking skills, so that you could be able to like that you can like figure out how to approach any different problem, even if you don't have, let's say, like the kind of the concrete, the knowledge of the concrete points of it, just like the ability to kind of approach politics in general.
Right. And I mean, so, for all of the joking online of how suddenly everyone becomes an epidemiologist as soon as we have a pandemic, right? You need to know maybe a little bit about science and statistics and those kinds of things to be able to at least, as you say, spot the BS, right? Of like, no, you can't actually, I mean, I ended up having to Google one of the statistical models to actually get what the joke was around sort of like what curves were and that kind of thing lately, because I didn't remember my trig well enough to actually get that. But like that mattered, right? Because the White House was making up stories and you can't actually use a graph that way. It doesn't like, and did you need to know all of that in order to know that? No, but you needed to know that that was not something you actually could do with these numbers. And actually, if you were going to use those numbers, you needed to be looking at more like this. You needed to at least have that level of understanding.
Mm-hmm. And then, so one thing kind of going forward, what should people do, people who are watching this, or people who aren't but should be watching this, what do people need to do to make sure, like, into the next year, as we prep for the academic year, that schools are getting fully funded and the level that they're promised?
So I mean, definitely we could use another federal round of funding at least. Secondly, this is going to be a rubber hits the road in terms of, did we really mean it when we were talking about progressively funding education? And if that means that your district doesn't get its 17.5%, but you guys can actually potentially make it work without it, and we don't thus tank, Fall River and New Bedford and Brockton, I think that this is a model much like when we did the Question 2 campaign around charter schools of, we need a statewide understanding of public education that says this isn't only about my kid or my town, this is about everybody's kid and everywhere. And if we're not looking out for the kids in Lawrence and Holyoke as a state, then we're not actually as a state doing our job. So I think I would say that. And I would urge people to stop thinking of education, and this is mostly directed to parents, but I would urge people to stop thinking of public education as a race. Like, nobody's losing this year, that nobody's falling behind. At one point, I saw a statistic that something like 91% of school children everywhere on planet Earth were out of school. Like, there's no place that a third grader is getting ahead of your kid, and if it is, it's a rare exception. So we've got to kind of back off a lot on that and think about whether or not we're meeting basic needs. Now, some of that is going to be whether or not our kids are going to learn how to read and calculate and so forth, but it's also keeping people alive and fed and, connected with other people in ways that schools usually do, because that's actually part of, we talk a lot about schools getting thrust into positions that they shouldn't necessarily, that maybe are other people's jobs. But right now, schools are part of that structure of support for families and kids. And that means that they need enough to be able to do that job too.
Yeah. And it also just speaks to the value that kind of wraparound services in schools that I know like many school districts are trying to figure out how you do that, like how you can provide those services, like providing food or providing other things that children did depend on the school for.
Yeah, and also, I mean, and in a strong model of that also tends to mean that more people know the families. And so, I mean, I actually just said to a number of districts today, you need to make sure that you're not assuming that what was true in mid-March is true now. If with those high unemployment numbers, you've got families where parents have lost their jobs. Like, that's guaranteed. You may have kids who now are eligible for free and reduced lunch that weren't in March. That don't have internet that did in March, like those kinds of things. So one of the models that I've seen districts embracing and that the state's encouraged has been, you need a point person for every kid, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be the elementary school teacher. Like, we've got adjustment counselors and guidance counselors and coaches and that kind of thing, but somebody's got to be the point person for that kid. And again, to your point, this isn't only about the education. This is about what else is going on in that child's life that may be the grandmother, the mother, the whoever that's involved.
And then any thoughts as we try to make sure that the state is fully funding this, any thoughts on like sources of revenue that the state can tap into to make sure that we are funding education to the level that it's needed, and like and not suddenly like shortchanging one of the most vital state investments?
No, I thought that the testimony that Mass Budget gave at the roundtable was very effective on that, right? That they not only, I love it when they not only come with the problem, they also come with a solution. So there are a number of loopholes in our tax law around corporate funding and so forth that we definitely should be looking at. It's not popular, but we should be doing it. Or not popular with some, I don't know, it'd be popular with me. By all means, let's go back and figure out how to actually have a wealth tax. We should absolutely be doing that. We shouldn't only be dependent on things like capital gains in order to actually be tapping that system of wealth. We know that we need it. We needed it before. We need it now. Relatedly, but this isn't actually as much a revenue thing. Apparently, part of the reason that we don't have municipal broadband is there's actually a law in Massachusetts against it.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
not sure. I don't actually really understand the regulation there, and I need to do more work on that. But if that's actually part of what's keeping this from going on, I would really like us to work on that, because we're now talking about a system that's equivalent to water and electricity in terms of what people need.
Yeah.
So particularly if we're going to be looking at not necessarily opening school buildings in the fall, if people could actually get their act together and work on like rolling that out, it would make a lot of people's lives, much better and easier in the way that rural electrification did, and the way that the post office keeps people connected. Like, we need to be thinking of internet in the same kind of way. So that's not a revenue thing, but it's another thing that the state could do that would be helpful.
It reminds me of the point about broadband, that apparently municipal broadband is banned by the state, is whenever I see in another state where the like conservative state government tries to block like the very liberal capital city from passing its own laws, I always think Massachusetts beat you by 100 years there, because like the home rule laws.
Oh, we'll let you do that. Like whenever I don't know, if you read the reports that State House News sends out about like what the House does, like more than half of what they do is like letting towns do stuff, and you're like, why did you need the legislature to let you do that? Like, that seems silly, but here we are.
Yeah, because that's one thing that I'm thinking about with this is the situation of how like municipalities often don't have a lot of taxing authority themselves. Like other than like levying property taxes, or kind of levying kind of consumption taxes, which are typically flat because like of the rules around flat taxes. Like you can kind of disguise things as call things fees, even if they're taxes, and try to be creative. But like municipalities are like hamstrung by the state from actually doing kind of what they could be, like the potential that they would have.
And there's an extra level of being irritated by that when you explain to school committee members that the calculation of how much state aid they get of their foundation budget is not only based on their local property tax calculation, but it's also based on the amount of local income taxes that come in from their zip code. Because inevitably someone in the room goes, well, wait a minute, we don't actually ever get any of those income taxes. They all go to the state. And the answer is, well, yes, they do, but it's another measure of your wealth, just not necessarily wealth that the community gets locally. So, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you probably have like some correlation between like the income tax collection and the property taxes. Probably, I'd be curious to see like what correlate, considering that like higher income people tend to have higher income properties, but it's probably not a perfect one-to-one.
Well, and the reason that it's a two-part calculation is it used to be all property taxes, and the Cape and the Berkshires complained because they have lots of property wealth, but not a lot of income wealth. So especially
if you have you have the summer homes.
Yeah, so that was the 1987 revision of, no, it was more recent than that. But I think it was 2007, there was a revision of the formula that actually included the other part of it. And that's why, because of the places that are, to your point, that are essentially outliers.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So since I don't want to keep you past like more than like around an hour, final takeaways for people watching that you want people to leave with.
I mean, keep an eye on things. First of all, understand that in many cases it isn't that people are holding out on you. People genuinely don't know how this is going to work. And so like if you're hearing that from like your local town officials, they would like to know too, but they don't necessarily know. And I think that many legislators feel the same way. And honestly, I've never felt so bad for the people who have to write state budgets as this year, because you want to talk about writing works of fiction. Like, I don't know, we're all going to do the best guess we have. Be cautious about the federal aid and making sure that you don't sort of just push that out. And I think that we need to be budgeting we first of all need to be budgeting with it's progressive for sure, because we've got a lot of need out there and it's growing need. And we need to make sure that we're really keeping our eye on the idea that that need is actively growing, that we're going to end up with more kids who are in more need. We're going to end up with more people who need more support. And I think we need to be writing our local budgets that way. And I think the state needs to be thinking of their local aid that way. I think this really has got to be a year where we're not making sure everybody gets theirs, but we're actually taking care of the people who most need it. And so we need to be doing that locally, but we absolutely need to be doing that at the state level too.
Nice. And so, since I think that you're a great tweeter and blogger, so if people want to follow you, where should they go?
I always feel like I should have like a warning label on my Twitter though, because like there's a lot of it. So honestly, if you go online and you just look for Tracy Novick, TracyNovick, you will find me everywhere, because for some reason, apparently that combination of names doesn't really exist much of anywhere else. So I'm just Tracy Novick on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook that way. You'll find my blog that way. Yeah, that's how you'll find me.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, thank you again. Thank you again.
Thanks for doing this.
This has been a lot of fun. And thank you for all the great work that you do.
Great. And I'm glad you're doing these.
Yeah.
Keep it up.
It's been a lot of fun.
Good.